be bringing more cloud and eventually cool things off a little and could bring some showers next week.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me.
And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. Over a drink, we have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good morning, it's 9:30 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Today we're exploring those GDP figures. The UK economy contracted this quarter. Will we contract for another, entering recession? Also, where is the Labour Party in all of this? Sir Keir Starmer missing in action. We'll explore that and the anniversary of the construction of the Berlin Wall. All to come after the headlines.
Good morning, it's coming up to 9:31. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. A drought is expected to be declared in many parts of England later today. The final decision will be made after a meeting by the government's National Drought Group. It follows months of dry weather and comes as Yorkshire Water becomes the latest to announce a hosepipe ban. A 4-day amber warning for extreme heat from the Met Office is currently in place for parts of England and Wales. It's also warning the risk of wildfires is exceptional. The UK economy shrank by 0.1% between April and June, according to official figures. That compares to the first 3 months of the year when GDP grew. The Office for National Statistics says the phasing out of COVID-19 spending is partly to blame. A big fall of economic growth in June, it says, was in part caused by the extra bank holiday to celebrate the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. FBI agents were looking for classified nuclear documents during the raid of Donald Trump's Florida home on Monday, according to local media. It comes just hours after the U.S. Department of Justice had asked a federal judge in Florida to unseal the search warrant. The unveiling has been welcomed by the former U.S. president, calling the search a political attack. The raid was part of an investigation into his handling of official presidential documents. And the shortlist of potential host cities for Eurovision 2023 has been released. 7 cities are on it: Birmingham, Glasgow, Leeds, Liverpool, Manchester, Newcastle and Sheffield. The UK was chosen to host the contest after organisers decided it couldn't be staged by last year's winners, Ukraine. TV online and DAB Plus Radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to Tom with The Briefing.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:33 and this is the briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now, first today, the UK economy contracted by 0.1% between April and June, according to the Office for National Statistics. This, whilst a smaller contraction than had been predicted, is obviously not good news. If the economy contracts again in the next 3 months, most economists would call that a recession. Now, this 0.1% contraction is compared to a growth of 0.8% in the previous quarter. The UK is still barely above the waterline of the fourth quarter of 2019. Yes, this dip is thought to be a combination of a reduction of spending on COVID testing and vaccinations, as well as, importantly, a fall in household spending as inflation and energy prices bite all of our finances. But how does this compare with other major economies? Well, the economist Julian Jessup has this morning produced a comparison of how the UK is doing compared to those comparable economies. France, this quarter, grew after having contracted last quarter. Germany, this quarter, was flat. And the US, of course, this quarter, entered its second quarter of negative growth, a recession. The UK's trajectory, however, does not look positive, with declining prospects. Let's speak now to John Ashmore, the editor of the CapEx economic news website. And John, I suppose there's a question in terms of how the United Kingdom is doing in what is a pretty tough situation internationally. No one's denying that there are big international headwinds here, but some European countries are growing this quarter. The United States is contracting, and we're contracting. Where does that put us? How are we doing?
Like you said, we're not doing well, but it's a story of economies across the Western world doing poorly. You know, there's not that much difference between the UK figures and those of France and Germany. A lot of people are picking up on the fact that the Platinum Jubilee decreased GDP a bit because everyone took a few days off. Had it not, its potential, potentially we could have had flat or 0.1. I think that really exposes how kind of illusory it is to focus too closely on a single month or a single quarter. Like you said, you want to look at the trend and where we're going. And it really doesn't look good. You know, the headwinds you mentioned, obviously energy is the big one. I think we're already seeing people battening down the hatches, reducing their spending on discretionary stuff, going out, bars, restaurants, that kind of thing. And that obviously doesn't bode well for the rest of the year. There's just also a great degree of uncertainty, and I think that always hampers confidence. So we don't really know exactly what the energy price cap is going to be later this year. There are various forecasts that it could go up as high as, $4,000 or something, really extraordinary figures. So yeah, I'm sort of personally, I'm more focused on the specific issues in the UK economy, especially those around utilities, than on international comparisons. Also, countries sort of measure GDP differently sometimes, so those comparisons can also be not necessarily misleading, but you can't just map one economy onto the other simply. But as you said, it's a pretty gloomy picture across the board, I'm afraid.
Now, listening to the Bank of England and the action that they took in the not-so-distant past, raising interest rates, trying to get a grip on inflation, is there not an argument, and some people do make this argument, that potentially a recession is the only way to end this sort of inflationary spiral that we're in? Do some people actually want us to go into recession?
Yeah, I mean, it's an argument we've had before. We had it very much in the 1980s. There was this famous phrase that, if it's not hurting, the medicine isn't working, essentially. So, yeah, you push unemployment up, you effectively kind of stall the economy deliberately to curb inflation. It's certainly a kind of orthodox economic view. Whether a politician would have the guts to come out and say that, I think is a rather different ballgame. And I think, it's something economists will discuss rather than politicians. We have a sort of strange situation here, though, because it's not like necessarily the 1970s. We talk about stagflation a lot. We have stagnation, inflation, but we don't have actually the third element to that, which is very high unemployment. So Britain is in a slightly strange situation where we have very low unemployment, but also flat wages, and high inflation. So it's a bit of an odd one. But yeah, as I say, I think it's a view that is held among the sort of economics community, but not one that I think you'll hear much from, say, Rishi Sunak or Liz Truss.
Yes, and listening to Liz Truss in the last week or so, she seems to be saying that her economic policies would be to try and avoid a recession. Is that possible?
I think she's up against it. I mean, there are things you can do in terms of, changing taxes and that kind of thing, but to my mind, they're quite at the margins compared to the enormity of the cost pressures that we've already mentioned in terms of energy. The big question for me is whether or not those high bills we're going to see are a temporary blip, seems too small a word, but a temporary feature of the economy, i.e. that will last maybe a year or two. And bear in mind, people are predicting 5 consecutive quarters of recession. Or is this like a permanent new normal? And if it's the latter, then we're going to have to make some really serious decisions about how we change our energy infrastructure, but also how we support households who are on lower incomes, who are literally going to have to choose between eating and heating this winter. And, those are big questions. That we're talking about corporation tax cuts, green levies, the national insurance hike. Those are all important things, but they are not on the same scale as the problems that we're going to face in the years to come if those high energy prices are embedded in the economy.
But of course, it's not just the energy utility bills that we are looking at today and indeed this week. We're now looking at, instead of rising bills for energy, or I should say as well as rising bills for energy, potentially rationing our water. There's been a big argument this morning as to what is to blame for the potential hosepipe bans and water rationing that we may well see now this summer. And the idea that, is it the fault of these privatised utilities on the one hand, or potentially the planning system preventing us from building the infrastructure that's necessary on the other hand? Which side do you fall on?
I think with all these kind of big macro problems, there's never a single culprit. So you could say that, yes, private companies could have spent more on repairing water infrastructure, stuff that causes leaks, things like that. You see it all the time. We have ancient kind of Victorian infrastructure, but not just for water, but for all sorts of things in this country. Tom, as you know, I am as big a critic of the planning system as they come. Again, we haven't built much in the way of reservoirs in the last kind of 30 years. It's not just about building new ones, though, and I think there are certain geographical conditions you have to bear in mind. You can't just plonk a reservoir anyway, but you can extend existing ones as well to increase capacity. But yeah, I'd say it's a combination of factors, and just again things that aren't necessarily in the company's control, which is just very high temperatures, drought in the east of the country. But again, this isn't necessarily anything new. I mean, we've had hosepipe bans throughout my lifetime in the summer. It's kind of become a feature of British summertime. But I think whatever it is, we need to. I think, as with energy and all the other things I've mentioned, we need to start thinking more strategically and long term about this stuff, and looking at problems as they come down the line. And one of the clips I was very struck with, I mean, sorry to return to energy again, but it really is the thing at the moment, was Nick Clegg in 2010 saying we shouldn't build more nuclear plants because they'd only come on stream in 2021 or 2022. Well, look where we are now. If we don't think in those kind of time horizons, then we're going to end up with more problems down the line than we have now.
The perennial problem of politics, this short-termism that plagues our system of government. I do want to end this conversation by noting we haven't built a new reservoir in the southeast of England since 1976. And the 1970s was when this sort of NIMBY movement really did grow up. I wonder how much local opposition to the construction of these things might well be biting us now further down the line. Potentially more long-term thinking needed, not just from our politicians, but from people too. For now, John Heshmore, editor of CapX, thank you very much for joining us this morning on The Briefing. Really appreciate it. Now, we've been speaking ad nauseum about the Tory party and its internal woes over the last 5 weeks. But what of the Labour Party? Where is its leader, Sir Keir Starmer? The Labour Party the Labour Party, the Labour, I do apologise, I'm going to start all of that all over again. Now, we've been speaking ad nauseum about the Tory party and its internal woes over the last 5 weeks. But what of the Labour Party? Where is its leader, Sir Keir Starmer? The Labour Party was not making big waves this week, and it was not Sir Keir Starmer. It wasn't even his predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn, or his predecessor, Ed Miliband. No, the leading Labour figure making headlines this week was someone who ceased to be a Labour leader all the way back in 2010. Such was the vacuum in Labour policy news, it took Gordon Brown to make a splash, demanding temporary nationalisation of energy companies. Sir Keir Starmer is frankly nowhere to be seen. In fact, people at home are hearing more of Martin Lewis, Gordon Brown, and even the Lib Dem leader Ed Davey over this crisis. And you know you're in trouble when the Liberal Democrats are making bigger waves than you are. So where is the Labour Party now? With the economy heading the way it is, they should be 20 points ahead in the polls potentially, and surely visible and present as an alternative government. Instead, the party seems to be absent without leave, when it's not shooting itself in the foot and disciplining front bench representatives over attending picket lines, that is. So the question is, where is Labour now? And why do they appear to be so lost? Well, I'm joined now by Dr. Richard Johnson, politics lecturer at Queen Mary University of London. And I suppose that is the big question. Why aren't we seeing any of Sir Keir Starmer?
I think the Starmer leadership has been defined by a kind of caution, which is quite interesting because when you think back to the leadership election in 2020, Starmer presented himself as continuity Corbyn, that he was really just going to be carrying on the policies of Corbyn, the radical policies of Corbyn, but with a better way of presenting them. And of course, really almost as soon as he got those votes from the Labour members to become leader, he's really abandoned that outlook. In many ways, concern one might have about the Starmer leadership is that he's operating under a kind of orthodoxy about political strategy that was accurate for the context of the 1990s, when Labour was indeed 20 points ahead in the polls. Tony Blair inherited a Labour Party from John Smith that had a double-digit poll lead. And the economic conditions of the 1990s were very different as well. This was a time of growing prosperity, certainly as the decade wore on. You know, one thing that I note is that when Blair was elected, it was only 15 years since the winter of discontent, which is about the same time as between now and the financial crisis. So I think Starmer has been advised by people who perhaps think, well, the way that Labour wins is by repeating the kind of caution that defined the Blair leadership in the lead up to 1997. But I'm afraid that the political and economic context for today is so different that I don't think that's a winning strategy.
Easy to be cautious when you're already very far ahead in the polls, but if you're trying to get to that lead in the first place, you might need to make a bit more of a splash. I wonder, though, in what direction should that splash be made? Gordon Brown, of course, calling for temporary nationalisation this week. But the Labour Party seems to be steering away from that. Indeed, the strategy of the Labour Party has been to veer away from the dangers that might bring electorally, promising things that couldn't be funded or indeed that people remember of less than fondly. What else could the Labour Party be doing? Or would it be simply enough for them to say something, whatever it is?
Part of the problem is that the Labour Party hasn't really looked at why it lost recent elections. There's a group in the Labour Party that think that Labour lost the 2019 election because it had a radical manifesto. There's a group that say that actually the kind of economic policies weren't to blame. It was Labour's approach on Brexit and support for a second referendum. I think there's more evidence that it's the latter than the former. Indeed, the 2017 manifesto, although Labour, of course, still lost that election, it saw the biggest swing to Labour in one election, 10 points. Labour's lead went up 10 points between 2015 and 2017. So the part of it is a problem where I think there's the people around Starmer want to say that actually the reason that Labour lost was because of the economic programme of the Corbyn years. But it might well be that actually it was the very Brexit policy that Keir Starmer himself had piloted as shadow Brexit secretary in those years, which is something a bit uncomfortable and awkward for Labour people to admit. And I think this goes to the heart of the problem with the Starmer leadership, is that there is a breach of trust. There's been two breaches of trust, I think, with Starmer leadership. One is with Leave voters, where Labour went into 2017 saying it would respect the referendum, and then Starmer used his period as shadow Brexit secretary to do everything to jettison that pledge. And then there's been another breach of trust with Labour members, where Starmer pledged to be continuity Corbyn on policy, and he hasn't been. And, you know, for a person who has made the whole case for his leadership that he's someone who can be trusted, in contrast to Boris Johnson, the Conservative parties, this seems like a slightly odd strategy to be taking.
Interesting, the Labour Party trying to set itself up as this trust versus no trust question, really basing its entire strategy on the fact that it was going to be battling Boris Johnson. I wonder if that becomes a much bigger problem for Labour now, talking about this question of trust, when they're up against someone like Liz Truss, were she to become the Conservative Party Prime Minister. Her whole brand, her whole leadership election has been built on this question of trust and following through with promises and reversing the national insurance rise that was promised to not go ahead. I wonder if there's that question of authenticity and trust in a dichotomy between Truss and Starmer, does Starmer start to fare worse?
The fundamentals of Starmer's leadership ratings are pretty poor. And this is partly because people don't feel they fully know him, but I think also because for many voters, he's known for those two things that I just mentioned. One is his support for a second referendum, and the other is saying that he would carry on the Corbyn manifesto and then abandoning it. If Truss can present herself as an authentic politician, someone who's principled and does what she believes, then that could be, I think, very damaging to Starmer. I have to say that I don't think her record during this leadership election has been very strong on that front, where there's been policy announcements and then they've been retracted and so on. I think she needs to step away from that. I think she really needs to think about what she believes and stick with it. We're in a period of time where people are very cynical about politicians and politics. Again, a difference from the 90s, even though there was sleaze in the 90s. The trust that people have in their political institutions is much lower now than it once was. And people are looking for politicians who are authentic. This is why outsider politicians have been doing so well in the past decade. I don't know if Truss can present herself as an outsider politician. It'd be interesting. She might have some room to do so. Yeah. Starmer has made that choice not to do so.
Well, that's a big opportunity or indeed challenge for whoever becomes the next leader of the Tory party. Well, for now, Richard Johnson, lecturer in politics at the Queen Mary University of London, thank you so much for talking through that really important issue. Finally today, to the mid-20th century, where from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain descended across the continent of Europe. The world became divided by a Cold War, and the Berlin Wall became the most hated symbol of that divide. It divided what is now the capital of a united Germany from 1961 until 1989. It was constructed by what was then the Soviet-dominated German Democratic Republic, known more commonly as East Germany, and its construction completely cut off West Berlin, creating two physically and ideologically contrasting zones of that city. Well, let's speak to the head of political economy at the Institute of Economic Affairs now. Christian Niemitz joins me to talk through this. Now, Christian, you grew up in what became a united Germany. What was the legacy of that divide? What was the legacy of that wall?
Well, firstly, there's a huge economic divide, or there was at the time of reunification, which still hasn't completely disappeared. And it cost West Germany a fortune to build up the East German economy. At the time of reunification, per capita output of East Germany was just 1/3 of the West German level. So it cost in total something like, I think, 2 trillion euros to build up the East German economy. And it's a divide that to this day has not completely disappeared and probably never will.
Looking around the world at these divides, and we've seen so many of them, East and West Germany, North and South Korea, North and South Vietnam for a time. I mean, we often see different political systems with really clear comparators. I wonder why that doesn't often filter through to the very obvious implication of which of those systems is a preferable one of governance.
Yes, that's because, as you know, socialists are very good at distancing themselves from real-world examples of socialism, claiming that it was all just a misunderstanding, that none of this was what Karl Marx originally had in mind. They just misinterpreted him, misunderstood him. We had the wrong people in power. But with proper socialists, with good people in charge, it would all go swimmingly. And this excuse comes up every time. I mean, even the GDR was initially, it had its Western fan clubs, including in the British trade union movement. Some MPs from the Labour Party at the time in the 1950s were quite pro-GDR, and that it was really only the construction of the Berlin Wall which was such a PR disaster that Western socialists abandoned that example and said, well, okay, yes, we are socialists, but not in that way. We want something different. But that excuse, unfortunately, never seems to wear off.
It is remarkable how it's these socialist countries that sometimes put up walls to keep people in, whereas more traditionally free market-minded countries, and we can agree or disagree as to whether it's a good idea, but they're more minded to put up walls to keep people out. This flow of migration, this idea that people want to move to areas that are more free market and tend to want to move away from countries that are less free market, surely tells us something about those systems.
Absolutely. And in that sense, the Berlin Wall was not some weird aberration. That was actually the socialist norm. All socialist countries, to varying degrees, restricted emigration. And East Germany was not the first one that did that. The Soviet Union got there far earlier. They banned emigration pretty much right from the start, from the early 20s. And then later, the People's Republic of China did the same thing. North Korea, to a lesser extent, Cuba later. For a while, it was East Germany that was the exception to this, because there initially you had free movement between the two German states in the very early days. It's just that they successively, over the course of the 1950s, made it harder and harder, brought in an emigration ban in the late 50s. It was just that that was unenforceable as long as you had this divided city, where West Berlin then became a gateway to the Federal Republic, and where within a city, of course, you couldn't enforce the emigration ban. That would be like trying to stop someone moving from Westminster to Lambeth. So therefore, once they had brought in that immigration ban at the end of the 50s, it was inevitable that at some point this would have to apply within Berlin as well.
To see how it cut streets, how it cut, to some extent, buildings, and the really the human tragedy of people trying to make it from one side to another. Well, the construction of that wall started on this day in 1961. Christian Niemitz, thank you for talking us through that really important historical anniversary. Well, that's it for the show today. Thank you for sticking with us. We're back from 9:30 every weekday. Up next, it's To The Point, but for now, I'll leave you with the weather.
Morning, Alex Deacon here with your latest weather update. Our Met Office extreme heat warning is in place until the end of Sunday. The amber warning covering large parts of England and East Wales. The heat will continue to rise, a little hotter today compared to yesterday, and perhaps hotter still tomorrow. So, as I said, covers large parts of England and much of East Wales, but it's a very warm day for the vast majority. The main exception will again be northern Scotland, where a persistent weather front continues to bring some cloud. But even here, I suspect the Western Isles and the Highlands will be brighter and warmer than yesterday, and the rain fizzling out across the Northern Isles too. Elsewhere, it's just a case of watching the sun shine and the temperatures rise, with the possible exception of the east coast, where there will at times be some mist and low cloud, and it will be a little cooler on the beaches here, but elsewhere a touch hotter than yesterday. 33, 34, 35, 36 is just about possible across parts of southern England. Through this evening, well, a balmy summer's evening, but overnight again we'll start to see some of this mist and low cloud just drifting back inland over parts of northeast England and eastern Scotland. Still fairly cloudy over northern Scotland with a spot or two of rain. Again, parts of northern Britain in the countryside could get down to single figures, but for most, certainly in towns and cities, another pretty difficult night for sleeping, with temperatures holding up in the mid to high teens. The details for Saturday, well, hot and sunny sums it up for most, but again, parts of these